Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to start a new Little Blue book, and it is Little Blue book number 293, and it is titled Francois Villon, Student, Poet, and Housebreaker. Now, a little caveat, this is book 2. Book 1 was about Francois Villon, but I was pronouncing it Villon, and it is Villon. I've been corrected by a very good friend who knows more about the French than I do. But that's just the book cover, because these things are fall apart. As you can see, there's just a page that they just crumble and fall apart at any bend or crease. So this is the book cover. I still have the book, but I figured I've started to pre-read and it's starting to fall apart. So here we go. And there is no copyright date. So here we go. Preface. The reader of this delightful study should, if he has not already done so, read the imaginatively realistic story based upon it, A Lodging for the Night. And that is the book that I just previously read. If you go back, the last two videos are on the book A Lodging for the Night, which is also on Francois Villon. All right, here we go. I am tempted to regret that I ever wrote on this subject, not merely because the paper strikes me as too picturesque by half, but because I regarded Villon as a bad fellow. Others still think well of him and can find beautiful and human traits where I saw nothing but artistic evil, and by the principle of the art. Those should have written of the man and not I. Where you see no good, silence is the best. Though this penitence comes too late, it may be well, at least, to give it expression. The spirit of Villon is still living in the literature of France. Fat Peg is oddly of a piece with the work of Zila or Concords, and the infinitely greater Flaubert, and while similar in ugliness, still surpasses them in native power. The old author breaks with breaks with an éclat de voix out of his tongue-tied century, has not yet been touched on his own ground, and still gives us the most vivid and shocking impression of reality. Even if there were not worth doing at all, it would be worth doing as well as he has done it, for the pleasure we take in the author's skill repays us, or at least reconciles us to the baseness of his attitude. Fat Peg, Le Gros Margot, is typical of much. It is a piece of experience that has nowhere else been rendered into literature, and a kind of gratitude for the author's plainness mingles, as we read, with the nausea proper to the business. I shall quote here a verse of an old student's song, worth laying side by side with Villon's startling ballad. This singer, also, had an unworthy mistress, but he did not choose to stay the wages of dishonor, or did not wish to share the wages of dishonor. And it is thus with both wit and pathos that he laments her fall. And I'm not reading the poem because it's written in French, without a English interpretation, so skipping it. But our illustrious writer of ballads, it was unnecessary to deceive. It was the flight of beauty alone, not that of honesty or horror or honor, that he lamented in his song. That the nameless medieval vagabond has the best of the comparison. There is now a Villon Society in England, and Mr. John Payne has translated him entirely into English, a task of unusual difficulty. I regret to find that Mr. Payne and I are not always at one as to the author's meaning. In such cases, I am bound to suppose that he is in the right, although the weakness of the flesh withholds me from anything beyond a formal submission. Robert Lewis Stevenson. Now, Francois Villon, student, poet, and housebreaker. Perhaps one of the most curious revolutions in literary history is the sudden bullseye light cast by M. Longnan on the obscure existence of Francois Villon. His book is not remarkable merely as a chapter of biography exhumed after 4 centuries. To readers of the poet, it will recall with a flavor of satire that characteristic passage in which he bequeaths his speeches. With a humorous reservation of the case, to the hospital for blind paupers, known as the 15 score. Thus equipped, let the blind paupers go and separate the good from the bad in the cemetery of the innocents. For his own part, the poet can see no distinction. Much have the dead people made of their advantages. What does it matter now that they have lain in state beds and nourished portly bodies upon cakes and cream? Here they all lie, to be trodden in the mud. The large estate and the small sounding virtue, and adroit or powerful vice, in very much the same condition, and a bishop not to be distinguished from a lamplighter with even the strongest spectacles. Such was Villon's cynical philosophy 400 years after his death, when surely all danger might be considered at an end. A pair of critical spectacles have been applied to his own remains. And though he left behind him a sufficiently ragged reputation from the first, it is only after these 400 years that his delinquencies have been finally tracked home, and we can assign him to his proper place among the good or wicked. It is a staggering thought, and one that affords a fine figure of the imperishability of man's acts, that the stealth of the private inquiry office can be carried so far back into the dead and dusty past. We are not so soon quit of our concerns as Villon fancied. In the extreme of dissolution, when not so much as a man's name is remembered, when his dust is scattered to the 4 winds, and perhaps the very grave and the very graveyard where he was laid to rest have been forgotten, desecrated, and buried under populous towns. Even in the extreme, even in this extreme, let an antiquary fall across a sheet of manuscript, and the name will be recalled. The old infamy will pop out into daylight like a toad out of a fissure in the rock, and the shadow of the shade of what was once a man will be heartily pillared by his descendants. Pause for break. A little while ago, and Villon was almost totally forgotten. Then he was revived for the sake of his verses, and now he is being revived with a vengeance in the detection of his misdemeanors. How unsubstantial is this projection of a man's existence, which can lie in abeyance for the centuries, and then be brushed up again and set forth for the consideration of posterity by a few dips in an antiquary's inkpot. This precarious tenure of fame goes a long way to justify those, and they are not few, who prefer cakes and cream in the immediate present. A wild youth. Francois de Montecorbert, alias Francois de Logray, alias Francois Villon, alias Michel Mouton, Master of Arts in the University of Paris, was born in that city in the summer of 1431. It was a memorable year for France on other and higher considerations. A great-hearted girl and a poor-hearted boy made, the one her last, the other his first appearance on the public stage of that unhappy country. On the 30th of May, the ashes of Joan of Arc were thrown into the Seine, and on the 2nd of December, R. Henry VI made his joyous entry, dismally enough, into disaffected and depopulating Paris. Sword and fire still ravaged the open country. On a single April Saturday, 1,200 persons, besides children, made their escape out of the starving capital. The hangman, as is uninteresting to note in connection with Master Francis, was kept hard at work in 1431. On the last of April, and on the 4th of May alone, 62 bandits swung from Paris gibbets. A mere confused or troublesome time. A more confused or troublesome time it would have been difficult to select for a start in life. Not even a man's nationality was certain. For the people of Paris, there was no such thing as Frenchmen. The English were the English indeed, but the French were only the Armagnacs, whom, with Joan of Arc at their head, they had beaten back from under their ramparts not 2 years before. Such public sentiment as they had centered about their dear Duke of Burgundy, and the dear Duke had no more urgent business than to keep out of their neighborhood. At least, and whether he liked it or not, our disreputable troubadour was dubbed and swaddled as a subject of the English crown. We hear nothing of Villon's father, except that he was poor and of mean extraction. His mother was given piously, which does not imply very much in an old French woman, and quite uneducated. He had an uncle, a monk, in an abbey at Angers, who must have prospered beyond the family average, and was reported to be worth 500 or 600 crowns. Of this uncle and his money box the reader will hear once more. In 1448, Francis became a student of the University of Paris. In 1450, he took the degree of bachelor. In 1452, that of Master of Arts. His bourse, or the sum paid weekly for his board, was of the amount of 2 sous. Now 2 sous was about the price of a pound of salt butter in the bad times of 1417. It was the price of a half pound in the worst times of 1419. And in 1444, just 4 years before Villon joined the university, it seems to have been taken as the average wage for a day's manual labor. In short, it cannot have been a very profuse allowance to keep a sharp-set lad in breakfast and supper for 7 mortal days, and Villon's share of the cakes and pastry and general good cheer, to which he is never weary of referring, must have been slender from the first. The educational arrangements of the University of Paris were, to our way of thinking, somewhat incomplete. Worldly and monkish elements were presented in a curious confusion, which the youth might disentangle for himself, if he had an opportunity. On the one hand, of acquiring much hair-drawn divinity and taste for formal disputation, he was put in the way of much gross and flaunting vice upon the other. The lecture room of a scholastic doctor was sometimes under the same roof with establishments of a very different and peculiarly unedifying order. The students had extraordinary privileges, which by all accounts they abused extraordinarily, and while some condemned themselves to an almost sepulchral regularity and seclusion, others fled the schools, swaggered in the streets with their thumbs in their girdle, passed the night in riot, and behaved themselves as the worthy forerunners of Jehan Frollo in the romance of Notre Dame in Paris. Villon tells himself that he was Villon tells us himself that he was among the truants, but we hardly need his avowal. The burlesque erudition in which he sometimes indulged implies no more than the merest smattering of the nearest smattering of knowledge. Whereas his acquaintance with backyard haunts and industries can only have been acquired by early and consistent impiety and idleness. He passed his degrees, it is true, but some of us who have been to modern universities will make their own reflections on the value of the test. As for his three pupils, Colin, Laurent, Gerard, Gaussian, and Jehan Marceau, if they were really his pupils, in any serious sense, what can we say but God help them? And sure enough, by his own description, they turned out as ragged, rowdy, and ignorant as he was, to be looked for from the views and manners of their rare preceptor. At some time or other, before or during his university career, the poet was adopted by Master Guillaume de Villon, chaplain of Saint Benoît la Bretonne, near the Sorbonne. From him he borrowed the surname, by which he is known to posterity. It was most likely from his house, called the Porte Rouge, and situated in a garden in the cloister of Saint Benoît. The master Francois heard the bell of the Sorbonne ring out the Angelus while he was finishing his small testament at Christmastide in 1456. Toward his benefactor, he usually gets credit for a respectable display of gratitude. But with his trap and pitfall style of writing, it is easy to make too sure. His sentiments are about as much to be relied on as those of a professional beggar. And in this, as in so many other matters, he comes towards us whining and piping the eye, and goes off again with a whoop and a finger to his nose. Thus he calls Guillaume de Villon his more than father, thanks him with a great show of sincerity for having helped him out of many scrapes, and bequeaths him his portion of renown. But the portion of renown which belonged to a young thief, distinguished, if at the period when he wrote this legacy he was distinguished at all, for having written some more or less obscene and scurrilous ballads, must have been little fitted to gratify the self-respect or increase the reputation of a benevolent ecclesiastic. The same remark applies to a subsequent legacy of the poet's library, with specification of one work which was plainly neither decent nor devout. We are thus left on the horns of a dilemma. If the chaplain was a godly, philanthropic personage who had tried to graft good principles and good behavior on this wild slip of an adopted son, these jesting legacies would obviously cut him to the heart. The position of an adopted son toward his adoptive father is one full of delicacy. Where a man lends his name, he looks for great consideration. And this legacy of Villon's portion of renown may be taken as the mere fling of an unregenerate scapegrace, who has wit enough to recognize in his own shame the readiest weapon of offense against a prosy benefactor's feelings. The gratitude of Master Francis figures on this reading as a fitful minus quantity. If, on the other hand, those jests were given and taken in good humor, the whole relation between the pair degenerates into the unedifying complicity of a debauched old chaplain and a witty and desolate young scholar. At this rate, the house with the red door may have rung with the most mundane minstrelsy, and it may have been below its roof that Villon, through a hole in the plaster, studied, as he tells us, the leisures of a rich ecclesiastic. It was perhaps of some moment in the poet's life that he should have inhabited the cloister of Saint Benoît. Three of the most remarkable among his early acquaintances are Catherine de Vassals, for whom he entertained a short-lived affection and an enduring and most unmanly resentment. Rainier de Montenay, a young blackguard of good birth, and Colin de Coy, a fellow with a marked aptitude for picking locks. Now we are on a foundation of mere conjecture, but it is at least curious to find that two of the canons of Saint Benoit answered respectively to the names of Pierre de Vassal and Etienne de Montenay, and that there was a householder called Nicolas de Coy in a street, the Rue des Poires, in the immediate neighborhood of the cloister. M. Longden is almost ready to identify Catherine as the niece of Pierre, Rainier as the nephew of Etienne, and Colin as the son of Nicholas. Without going so far, it must be owned that the approximation of names is significant as we go on to see the part played by each of these persons in the sordid melodrama of the poet's life. We shall come to regard it as even more notable. It is not Clow who has remarked that after all everything lies in juxtaposition. Many a man's destiny has been settled by nothing apparently more grave than a pretty face on the opposite side of the street, and a couple of bad companions round the corner. Catherine de Vassales, or de Vassal, the change is within the limits of Villon's license, had plainly delighted in the poet's conversation, near neighbors or not. They were much together, and Villon made no secret of his court, and suffered himself to believe that his feeling was repaid in kind. This may have been an error from the first, or he may have estranged her by subsequent misconduct or temerity. One can easily imagine Villon an impatient wooer. One thing at least is sure, that the affair terminated in a manner bitterly humiliating to Master Francis. In the presence of his lady love, perhaps under her window, and certainly with her convenience, he was unmercifully thrashed by one Noel Jolly, beaten, as he says himself, like dirty linen on the washing board. It is characteristic that his malice had notably increased between the time when he wrote the small testament immediately on the back of the occurrence, and the time when he wrote the large testament 5 years after. On the latter occasion, nothing is too bad for his damsel with the twisted nose, as he calls her. She is spared neither hint nor accusation, and he tells his messenger to accost her with the vilest insults. Villon, it is thought, was out of Paris when these amenities escaped his pen, or perhaps the strong arm of Noel Jolly would have been again in requisition. So ends the love story, if love story it may properly be called. Poets are not necessarily fortunate in love, but they usually fall among more romantic circumstances and bear their disappointment with a better grace. The neighborhood of Rainier de Montenay and Colin de Coy were probably more influential on his afterlife than the contempt of Catherine. For a man who is greedy of all pleasures and provided with little money and less dignity of character, we may prophesy a safe and speedy voyage downward. Humble, or even truckling virtue may walk unspotted in his life, but only those who despise the pleasures can afford to despise the opinion of the world. A man of a strong, heady temperament, like Villon, is very differently tempered. His eyes lay hold on all provocations greedily, and his heart flames up at a look into imperious desire. He is snared and broached to by anything and everything, from a pretty face to a piece of pastry in a cook-shop window. He will drink the rinsing of the wine cup, stay the latest at the tavern party, tap at the lit windows, follow the sound of singing, and beat the whole neighborhood for another reveler as he goes reluctantly homeward, and grudge himself every hour of sleep as a black empty period in which he cannot follow after pleasure. Such a person is lost, if he have not dignity, or, failing that, at least pride, which is its shadow, and in many ways its substitute. Master Francis, I fancy, would follow his own eager instincts without much spiritual struggle, and we soon find him fallen among thieves in sober, literal earnest, and counting as acquaintances the most disreputable people he could lay his hands on. Fellows who stole ducks in Paris moat, sergeants of the criminal court, and archers of the watch, blackguards who slept at night under the butcher's stalls, and for whom the aforesaid archers peered about carefully with lanterns. Rainier de Montenay, Colin de Coy, and their crew all bound on a favoring breeze toward the gallows. The disorderly abbess of Fort Royal, who went about at fair time with soldiers and thieves, and conducted her abbey on the queerest principles, and most likely Perrette Malger, the great Paris receiver of stolen goods, not yet dreaming, poor woman, of the last scene of her career, when Henry Cousin, executor of the high justice, shall bury her, alive and most reluctant, in front of the new Montenay gibbet. Nay, our friend soon began to take a foremost rank in this society. He could string off verses, which is always an agreeable talent, and he could make himself useful in many other ways. The whole ragged army of Bohemia, and whosoever loved good cheer without at all loving to work and pay for it, are addressed in contemporary verses as the subjects of Francois Villon. He was a good genius to all hungry and unscrupulous persons, and became the hero of a whole legendary cycle of tavern tricks and cheateries. The best these were doubtful levities, rather too thievish for the schoolboy, rather too gamesome for a thief. But he would not linger long in this equivocal borderland. He must soon have complied with his surroundings. He was one who would go where the cannikin clinked, not caring who should pay. And from supping in the wolves' den, there is but a step to hunting with the pack. And here, as I am on the chapter of his degradation, I shall say all I mean to say about his darkest expression, and be done with it for good. Some charitable critics see no more than a geste d'esprit, a graceful and trifling exercise of the imagination, in the grimy ballad of Fat Peg. I am not able to follow these gentlemen to this polite extreme. Out of all Villon's works, that ballad stands forth in flaring reality, gross and ghastly, as a thing written in a contraction of disgust. M. Langdon shows us more and more clearly at every page that we are to read our poet literally, that his names are the names of real persons, and the events he chronicles were actual events. But even if the tendency of criticism had run the other way, this ballad would have gone far to prove itself. I can well understand the reluctance of worthy persons in this matter, for of course it is unpleasant to think of a man of genius as one who held, in the words of Mariana de Bolt, a place for which the paintedest fiend of hell would not in reputation change. But beyond this natural unwillingness, the whole difficulty of the case springs from a highly virtuous ignorance of life. Paris now is not so different from the Paris of then, and the whole of the doings of Bohemia are not written in the sugar-candy pastorals of Murger. It is really not at all surprising that a young man of the 15th century with a knack of making verses should accept his bread upon disgraceful terms. The race of those who do is not extinct, and some of them, to this day, write the prettiest verses imaginable. After this, it were impossible for Master Francois to fall lower. To go and steal for himself would be an admirable advance from every point of view, divine or human. And yet, it is not as a thief, but as a homicide, that he made his first appearance before angry justice. On June 5th, 1455, when he was about 24, and had been master of arts for a matter of 3 years, we behold him for the first time quite definitely. Angry justice had, as it were, photographed him in the act of his homicide, and M. Langdon, rummaging among old deeds, had turned up the negative and printed it off for our instruction. Villon had been supping copiously, we may believe, and sat on a stone bench in front of the church of St. Benoit, in company with a priest called Gillis, and a woman of the name of Isabel. Yeah. It was 9 o'clock, a mighty late hour for the period, and evidently a fine summer's night. Master Francis carried a mantle, like a prudent man, to keep him from the dews, serene, and had a sword below it, dangling from his girdle. So these three dallied in front of St. Benoit, taking their pleasure. Suddenly there arrived upon the scene a priest, Philip Chamor of Sermaize, also with sword and cloak, and accompanied by one Master Jehan Lamarde. Sermaize, according to Villon's account, which is all we have to go upon, came up blustering, and denying God. As Villon rose to make room for him upon the bench, thrust him rudely back into his place, and finally drew his sword and cut open his lower lip, by what I should imagine was a very clumsy stroke. Up to this point, Villon professes to have been a model of courtesy, even of feebleness, and the brawl, in his version, reads like the fable of the wolf and the lamb. But now the lamb was roused. He drew his sword, stabbed Sermaize in the groin, knocked him on the head with a big stone, and then, leaving him to his fate, went away to have his own lip doctored by a barber of the name of Fouget. In one version, he says that Gillis, Isbal, and Lamarde ran away at the first high words, and that he and Sermaize had it out alone. Another, Lamarde, was represented as returning and wresting Villon's sword from him. The reader may please himself. Sermaize was picked up, lay all that night in the prison of St. Benoit, where he was examined by an official of the chalet, and expressly pardoned Villon, and died on the following Saturday in the Hotel Dieu. This, as I have said, was in June, not before January of the next year, could Villon extract a pardon from the king. But while his hand was in, he got two. One is for Francois de Logues, alias de Villon, and the other runs in the name of Francois de Montecorbet. Montecorbet. Not even going to try it. Nay, it appears there was a further complication, for in the narrative of the first of these documents it is mentioned that he passed himself off upon Fouget, the barber surgeon, as one Michel Mouton. M. Langdon has a theory that this unhappy accident with Sermaize was the cause of Villon's subsequent irregularities, and that up to that moment he had been the pink of good behavior. But the matter has, to my eyes, a more dubious air. A pardon necessary for Des Lodges and another for Montsibert, and these two the same person, and one or both of them known by the alias of Villon, however honestly come by. And lastly, in the heat of the moment, a fourth name thrown out with an assured countenance. A ship is not to be trusted that sails under so many colors. This is not the simple bearing of innocence. No, the young master was already treading crooked paths. Already he would start and bleach at the hand. Start and blench at a hand upon his shoulder, with the look we know so well in the face of Hargoth's idle apprentice. Already in the Blue Devils, he would see Henry Cousin, the executor of high justice, going in dolorous procession toward Montfaucon, and hear the wind and the birds crying around Paris Gibbet. And that's the end of that. That's where we'll stop today. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.